So now that we've thought a little bit about this kind of unusual combination of types of workers in the US labor market, the janitors and the doctors, we have to ask ourselves, how is that affecting the US labor market? And when an ordinary person thinks about this, they often intuitively think more people, lower wages. And this idea, I say on the slide here, this is what economists call the Malthusian idea. So Malthus was he was a professor of theology. And in a famous essay, he tried to explain why it was that even though, for the course of human history, there's been some minor changes. We went from horse and buggy to wheel and so on, that it was the case that we never seemed to really get very far ahead. And he argued that the reason why is because inevitably, if there was enough income around, people would have more children, or their children would survive longer. The greater number of children would then drive down wages until we got to some level of subsistence. And it was a pretty grim view of the labor market. And that idea is still pretty intuitively appealing when you're thinking about, the number of taxi drivers in Los Angeles. You say, well, if there's more illegal immigrants legal immigrants in Los Angeles and they want a job, they're going to have to work as taxi drivers. It's going to drive down the wage of taxi drivers. But on the other hand, it's not the case that large countries have lower wages or that large cities have lower wages. And I'm going to show you some evidence that actually when you have an increase in the population of a country or an increase in the population of a city, it doesn't seem to be the case that that drives down wages. And so why is that? Well, this was an argument that the neoclassical economists had in the late 1800s when they realized that something was going on. That was a time when the economy was kind of moving from traditional very low levels of wages for most workers, kind of subsistence agriculture, to a kind of a more modern era. And they pointed out that actually, as long as you can provide extra workers with extra stuff to work with, i.e. capital, then you can avoid the Malthusian trap. And so today, that's the view we have. We don't, actually most countries try and kind of incentivize people to have more children. Most countries, France is the one that everybody knows about because we all love to make fun of France. But it's true that, there's a very generous system, and when you have your fourth kid, you get a nice big check and so on. And they do that in Quebec, in my home country as well. So the understanding is that population growth per se is not damnation in the future, okay? And the reason why is because of this idea that we can build up machinery, buildings, infrastructure, and keep up and allow workers to become as productive as they would have been, even though there's more of them. So the way that economists think about this, and I'm going to call this the first order effect of immigration, is that a rise in the labor force leads to an increase in investment because now there's more workers available, and as long as the ratio of capital per worker stays on trend, then the economy can actually move along unperturbed. And if you don't take anything else away from today's lecture, then this would be the one thing that I would hope you would remember, that in a certain sense, immigration and population growth are the same thing in an economic model, number one. And number two, population growth per se is not necessarily bad for the labor market. In fact, what's called new growth theory says that many, many economies would probably be better if they were a little bit bigger. And almost all New Zealanders, Canadians believe that, and Australians. So that basically, if you grew up in Canada, you think there's this huge pile of land to the north that's occupied by mosquitoes and moose. And if we could just get a few more people in there, we'd be a more productive country. So that then says, all right, if we're trying to understand, does immigration really hurt the economy, one thing we really should be looking at is when there's more people coming in, what's happened to capital? And this is a graph that shows the trend and the rate of capital per unit of labor. This is from a Bureau of Labor Statistics data set that's pretty easy to download. You can see that it's pretty steady. It goes up and down, but pretty steady. And in particular, in the period between 1990 and 2006, which was a period of massive immigration in the United States, that's the big period of inflows of undocumented immigrants and so on, it was pretty much on trend. Now, there's another way to look at this that's kind of like a way that I'm going to talk about when we talk about immigration per se, and that is to try and isolate large-scale events that happened when there was a big change in population, what happened to capital. The best example of that in modern history was the movement of people from the former Soviet Republic to Israel. And that led to a 25% increase in the Israeli population. There's a graph. It's not in color because I should have actually tried to do this, but the dark solid line is the investment rate per income level in Israel. And the dotted line is a set of other countries that are meant to track Israel in the absence of this population inflow. And you can see around 1990, when this massive inflow of people came to Israel, there was a massive increase in productivity. And this study, which was done by a former student of mine named Ethan Lewis at Dartmouth College, shows that, in fact, in a remarkably short period of time, just a few years, the capital labor ratio was back on track in Israel. Okay. So that says probably when we're thinking about immigration, we shouldn't be so worried about becoming a bigger country. Now, there are some side effects of being a bigger country. It gets congested, and we actually do need to fix the roads and stuff like that. And so, there has to be some infrastructure investment. We have to try and convince people not all to want to live in New York, Los Angeles, Washington, and Boston, and San Francisco, that kind of problem. But modulo that problem, it doesn't look like population growth per se is a problem. There is another aspect of the problem, though, and that is, what about skill group specific supplies? So, as we've seen, U.S. immigration inflows are kind of composed of groups at the bottom and the top, and you might ask, does that matter? So does it matter that there's all these undocumented and low-skilled immigrants from Central and South America and Mexico? Are they particularly putting pressure on the wages of low-skilled natives? And I think that when I first started working in immigration 25 years ago, this was actually the #1 concern that I had. I think that most people say, well, immigration could potentially make the country better, but this is a time, it's been a time for a long time, that low-skilled workers face other difficulties. We don't necessarily want them to be bearing the burden of adjustment for immigration as well. And economists have sort of decided that there's probably a way to model that effect. I'm not going to go into the details here, but the basic economic model says we want to divide the labor market into 2 broad groups, highly educated and less highly educated. So something like the bottom and the lower middle versus the top and the upper middle. And those 2 groups as a whole more or less summarize the characteristics of the labor force. So if immigrants and natives are nearly equal in those 2 groups, then immigration isn't really changing the relative wage of the top group. And so then the question has been, well, first of all, what has been happening in terms of the numbers of immigrants? And secondly, what can we learn about how this relative flows of immigration are affecting relative wages? And now I want to talk about different kinds of evidence that people have brought to bear on this question. And there's sort of 3 basic kinds. The first kind of evidence is the kind I think that is pretty obviously compelling. It's not without difficulty, but the idea is, let's look at Los Angeles versus Pittsburgh, okay? Los Angeles is over 50% immigration. Pittsburgh's under 10% immigration. Are wages a lot lower in Los Angeles than they are in Pittsburgh? Well, actually, if you look across those cities, and there's many, many cities in the United States, we have a great advantage in studying immigration that we have so many large cities. On average, it's the case that cities that have more immigrants have, on average, more low-skilled workers per capita. Okay, so Los Angeles has a relatively high fraction of low-skilled people overall compared to Pittsburgh. So Los Angeles is a less skilled city than Pittsburgh. And Miami is like in the same boat, whereas St. Louis is kind of much higher than that. Lots of cities that you wouldn't necessarily think of as particularly privileged, like Pittsburgh or St. Louis, Cincinnati, look pretty good in terms of skill composition of their workforce, and that's because they don't have very many, relatively speaking, low-skilled immigrants. When we compare across those cities, however, we don't see any strong evidence that wages of low-skilled natives are lower in the Miamis and Los Angeles than they are in St. Louis and Cincinnati. And this is the kind of graph that you can draw. So on the x-axis, I've drawn the inflow rate of Mexican immigrants to each city between 1990 and 2000. And just to get a sense of the magnitudes here, over here on the right of the graph, we've got a few cities, these are larger cities in the US, where in that 20-year period, something like 10 or 15% of the population was added by low-skilled migrants from Mexico. Okay, so that's a massive change in the population of that city, pushing it to become a low-skilled city. Okay, that's kind of thing. And on the y-axis then, what I've got is each of these is a city, each dot is a city, and on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, what I've got is the relative change in percentage points of dropout educated natives relative to the national trend. The national trend is the green line. And you can see that even when we go way over to cities like Miami, Los Angeles, Brownsville, Texas, Laredo, Texas, those are the cities over here in the far right, there's not any strong evidence that wages have been pushed down in those cities. So that's one piece of evidence that people have brought to bear. Now you can push that a little bit further because if you look, here's a set of 5 cities, and these cities are different not just in terms of overall immigration, so Dallas and Los Angeles are high immigration inflow cities, but also in terms of what kinds of immigrants are going to those cities, okay? And if you know something about these cities, this actually fits with some of your intuition. So Chicago is a city that has a fairly large number of immigrants, but unlike a lot of these other cities, it's a city where the inflow of immigrants is pretty highly skilled. Okay, they're getting a lot of Poles, basically. And so the Poles that come to the United States are fairly highly educated. Dallas is getting mostly immigrants from Mexico and Central and South America, so its skill composition is shifting. And you can use that feature and do the same kind of analysis I just talked about, and you would get the same answer. Okay, so that's one kind of evidence. What about other kinds of evidence? Well, another kind of evidence, this is a study that I'm pretty well known for, studying the effect of the Mariel boat lift. So the origin of this study is an undergraduate thesis. I was at Princeton. I was at Princeton at that time. Every undergraduate had to write a thesis, and one of the students in my class was from Miami, and he told me about the Mariel boat lift and sort of said, well, I want to try and write a senior thesis on the effect of the Mariel boat lift. He never got that done, but he gave me the idea, and so I ended up writing a very simple little paper just looking at what happened when about 150,000 migrants moved from Cuba to Miami. About something between 60 and 75% of them ended up staying in Miami. So that was, over the course of a few months, a massive increase, sort of like the Israeli evidence, in the population of Miami, almost all of whom were low-skilled, non-English speaking immigrants. Similar studies have been done since the time I did my study, one at the end of the Angolan colonial war in Portugal, one at the end of the Algerian war in France, and one, as we sort of talked about this already, the Israeli immigration. And they all give the same pattern. This is data put together by Giovanni Perry and co-author, looking at what happened in Miami relative to a set of other cities which they call synthetic Miami. Now, synthetic Miami sounds like it could be a fabric for clothes that you wouldn't be seen in if you're my age. But that's weighted average of other cities. And they've chosen synthetic Miami to kind of follow Miami. The boat lift occurs in 1980. Okay, now, what we're looking at is weekly wages. Weekly wages in Miami were kind of trending down a little bit in this period. They were trending down in synthetic Miami. The boat lift occurs. What happens in Miami versus synthetic Miami? Well, basically nothing. Despite the 70 or 80,000 extra workers in the labor force, all of whom are, or almost all of whom are very unskilled, you don't find any evidence that that affected average wages or the wages of lower skilled workers. So that's the kind of evidence that people have done. Now, there's a new study. People are always coming up with creative ideas. The same guy, actually, Giovanni Perry, was inspired by a project that somebody had done on the end of the Bracero program, which was in 1960, and realized that in 1929 to 1937, the US had a big, what we euphemistically called the repatriation program for Mexicans. So about 400 or 500,000 Mexicans in the United States, mostly in California and along the Texas border, but up into New Mexico and Arizona, were basically not very graciously told that they had to move back to Mexico. Interestingly, this included both immigrants and second generation, so they're kids who were born in the United States, and they were all basically sent back. So in cities like Brownsville and El Paso, that amounted to a 24% reduction in the labor force. In cities like Anaheim and Tucson, it was about a 10% loss. In most cities along further away from the border and so on, it was a very trivial effect. And so what they do is they study that effect by looking city by city and saying, okay, if you lost more Mexicans in that period, between 1930 and 1940, what happened to wages and employment opportunities and unemployment of natives? And again, they basically don't find anything. In fact, they find that, if anything, it looks like where the Mexicans went away, natives might have been slightly disadvantaged. So that's this kind of big shock evidence. There's another final kind of evidence that I'm not going to have much time to talk about, but there is one kind of evidence that comes from model-based simulation. And this is the kind of evidence that the person who's probably the most well-known person arguing that immigration has a large negative effect is a scholar named George Borjas at Harvard. And he has worked on trying to use the simulation models. These are models of how the economy responds based on a couple of parameters. And the key parameters in these models, these are like alphas and betas. They're the Greek letters that are in your scientific formula that somehow tell whether there's going to be a big effect or a small effect. So those are the things you have to set. And there's some disagreement in the literature about how to set those Greek letters to basically deal with two questions. One of them is, how much degree of substitution do we have between dropout labor and high school labor? And the other is, are immigrants and natives with the same immigration exactly the same in the labor market, or are they somewhat complementary, somewhat substitutable? And let me just show this is a summary of George has a pretty comprehensive new book, and these numbers are taken from his book. The top row is his simulation results of what did immigration between 1990 and 2010 do to native male wages for each of a different set of categories of workers. So the lowest one with the red circles are high school dropouts. Those are the workers who he argues are the most heavily affected. And his baseline preferred specification in the top row is that immigration during that time period lowered wages of high school dropouts by 3%. Okay? Now, if you look across the categories, the effects are pretty small for everybody else, and on average, the effect is 0, and that's because this model has this feature, this anti-Malthusian feature. It has, on average, more immigrants doesn't lower wages. It can just distort the wages for different subgroups. So in some sense, the takeaway from this table is actually very straightforward. The scholar who's the most negative about immigration impacts on labor markets says that if there was an effect, it was about a 3% reduction over a 20-year period in wages for the lowest skilled guys at the bottom, and almost nothing for anybody else. Small changes in the parameters of his model lead, the second row suggests those, does some of those changes and lead to slightly smaller things. So the argument at that side of the literature is really over very, very small numbers. So even people who are most negative about immigration agree that it doesn't have very large effects. Okay.